9 tin mill steel production lines used to operate in the United States. 9 facilities where American workers turned raw steel into the thin, coated sheets that are stamped into every can of beans, every can of tuna, every can of soup, every can of vegetables, every can of fruit, every can of baby formula on every grocery shelf in every state in this country. 9 lines, today there are 3. The Can Manufacturers Institute documented that a series of decisions by domestic steel producers over the past 8 years led to cuts that decreased American production of tin mill steel by 75%. 3/4 of the domestic capacity to make the steel that becomes a food has been eliminated. And as a result, American can makers now import nearly 80% of the tin mill steel they need from foreign trade partners. 80%. And on that 80% of imported steel, the federal government has imposed a 25% tariff that was recently doubled to 50% in some categories, which means the steel that makes the can that holds the cheapest food in America is now taxed at a rate that the American Action Forum projects will push canned food prices up by as much as 15%. With contracts renegotiated between 2026 and 2027 set to deliver the sharpest increases yet. A 20-year-old student in Omaha named Cal Johnson, who works 2 part-time jobs and depends on SNAP benefits, told The Guardian that canned foods make up a big part of his diet. Tuna, corned beef hash, beans, chicken soup, Spam, fruit. He said people are already stocking up on non-perishable goods before they get more expensive, and that there is a feeling of panic and having to prepare. He is not panicking, he is reading the supply chain correctly. The cheapest food in America is disappearing, not from the shelves. From the price range that made it the cheapest food. A can of beans that cost 79 cents in 2019 costs $1.29 today, and is on a trajectory to cost $1.49 or $1.59 by 2027, when the new steel contracts are fully priced in. And for the 42 million Americans who depend on SNAP. For the 14% of households that are food insecure. For the 1 in 3 Americans who skipped a meal in the past year. And for every family that switched to canned goods as their last affordable option when fresh food became too expensive. The disappearance of cheap canned food is not an inconvenience. It is the elimination of the final fallback, and the U.S. canned food market is a $37.65 billion industry that Renub research projects will grow to $53 billion by 2034. That growth is not driven by consumer preference, it is driven by consumer desperation. Americans are not buying more canned food because they want to. They are buying more canned food because they cannot afford the alternative. Fresh produce is up 26% since 2020. Meat is up 22%. Dairy is up 18%. Eggs have doubled and tripled during avian flu spikes. And every time a fresh category becomes unaffordable, a wave of consumers migrates to canned goods as the last tier of affordable protein. Affordable vegetables, affordable fruit. That migration is what is driving the market growth. And the tariffs are now raising the floor price of the tier those consumers migrated to. There is no next tier below canned food. Below canned food there is rice, dry beans, and water. And for 42 million Americans on SNAP, the distance between canned food and rice and water is the distance between a diet that sustains health and a diet that does not. America destroyed its own can-making infrastructure, and now it cannot afford to replace it. Here is the part of this story that nobody is explaining to you in plain English. The 2018 steel tariffs during Trump's first term were supposed to protect American steel production and create American jobs. Instead, they destroyed the domestic tin mill steel industry. When the tariffs were imposed in 2018, domestic steel producers did not invest in new tin mill capacity. They shut down existing lines. Because tin mill steel is a specialty product with thin margins, and the general steel tariffs made it more profitable for domestic producers to focus on higher-margin products like structural steel, automotive steel, and pipeline steel. The tin mill lines were the least profitable, so they were the first to close. 9 lines became 3. And the capacity utilization rate for iron and steel products, which rose slightly after the initial tariffs to about 80%, has since fallen to 72% as of April 2025. Despite tariffs remaining in place for 7 years, total crude steel production in the United States fell from 90 million tons to approximately 81 million tons. And the American share of global steel production dropped from 11% to 4%. The tariffs did not rebuild American steel. They accelerated the decline of a specific critical subsector, while the broader industry continued shrinking. And now the second round of tariffs. The 25% rate that was doubled in some categories lands on an industry that is 75% smaller than it was when the first round was imposed. There is almost no domestic tin mill capacity left to protect. The tariffs are taxing imports because there is no domestic alternative. And the cost of that tax is being passed directly to the companies that make the cans and directly from those companies to the consumers who buy the food inside them. Conagra, the company that makes Chef Boyardee, Hunt's Tomatoes, Healthy Choice, Marie Callender's, and dozens of other canned products, disclosed on its earnings, call that inflation and the current tariff environment would add approximately 3% to the company's cost of goods sold. More than $200 million annually in 2026. That is $200 million in additional costs for a single company. Kraft Heinz said it expected organic net sales to fall between 1.5 and 3.5% due to inflation. Tariffs and shifting consumer behavior. Campbell's acknowledged that tariff-related costs would reduce earnings per share by 3 to 5 cents. These are not small numbers. These are the three largest canned food companies in America telling their shareholders that the cost of putting food in a can has structurally increased, and that the increase will be passed to consumers on a timeline that begins now and accelerates through 2027. Canned soup is up 10% in a single year, and every product inside a can is following the same curve. Canned soup prices have risen approximately 10% in just the past year, outpacing general inflation by a factor of 4. That is not a one-time adjustment. It is the leading edge of a repricing that is moving through every category of canned foods simultaneously. Canned vegetables are being hit by the same steel tariff pressure on the can itself combined with rising agricultural input costs. Fertilizer prices are tied to natural gas, which has been destabilized by the Iran war and the Strait of Hormuz closure. Farm diesel costs have surged. Labor shortages in agricultural regions, driven in part by immigration enforcement that has removed workers from the fields, are pushing harvest costs higher. And the weather has not cooperated. Drought conditions in parts of the Midwest and excessive rainfall in the Southeast have reduced yields for corn, green beans, and tomatoes, three of the highest volume canned vegetable products in America. Canned tuna and seafood are being hit from a different direction. Fishing industries are struggling with fluctuating fuel prices. Because every fishing vessel runs on diesel, and diesel is priced off oil that went from $70 to $120 per barrel during the Iran war. Stricter fishing regulations and environmental concerns about overfishing have reduced catch volumes. Transportation disruptions from the Hormuz closure have increased the cost of shipping canned seafood from processing facilities in Southeast Asia, where a significant portion of the global tuna supply is processed. And canned beef products including beef stew, corned beef hash, and roast beef face the most severe pressure of all. The USDA projects that the U.S. cattle inventory will continue decreasing through 2025 and 2026, dropping to approximately 86 million head, a level not seen since 1951. With the herd at a 75-year low, the USDA predicts record-high beef prices starting in 2026. The can costs more because of steel tariffs. The beef inside the can costs more because the herd is the smallest in 75 years. The diesel that delivered the can to the store costs more because of the Iran war. And the electricity that powers the grocery store refrigeration and lighting costs more because natural gas prices are elevated. Every input into every canned product is simultaneously more expensive than it was 12 months ago. And the contracts that lock in those costs for 2026 and 2027 have not yet been fully reflected in shelf prices. The American Action Forum documented that many manufacturers expect further price hikes to hit store shelves between 2026 and 2027, as annual contracts are renegotiated starting in the October-December timeframe. And the Iran war has added an entirely new cost layer that was not priced into any manufacturer's projections when those projections were made. Oil went from $70 to $120 per barrel, diesel surged, natural gas spiked. Shipping costs through the Strait of Hormuz. which handles 20% of global oil and a significant share of liquefied natural gas, have either become prohibitive or physically impossible. The energy cost embedded in every step of canned food production, from the tractor in the field to the processing plant to the warehouse to the delivery truck, has increased by double digits in a matter of weeks. And those costs have not yet appeared on the shelf because the supply chain lag is 60 to 120 days. The cans you buy today at the grocery store were manufactured with steel purchased months ago, filled with food processed weeks ago, and shipped with fuel purchased at pre-war prices. The cans that arrive in June and July will reflect the new reality. And that reality is a compounding of two cost shocks: steel tariffs and energy crisis, hitting the same product at the same time from two different directions. Food banks are running out of canned goods, and 20,000 manufacturing jobs could disappear. When canned food gets expensive, two things happen simultaneously that create a feedback loop of increasing scarcity for the people who need it most. First, consumers who have alternatives switch away from canned goods. Upper-income households that were buying canned tomatoes for convenience start buying fresh tomatoes instead. Middle-income households that were buying canned soup as a quick dinner option switch to frozen meals or skip the purchase entirely. The demand for canned goods among people who have options decreases, which reduces the volume that manufacturers produce, which increases the per-unit cost for the remaining buyers, who are disproportionately the lowest-income Americans who have no alternative. Second, food banks, which depend on canned goods as the backbone of their distribution, because cans are shelf-stable, easy to transport, and safe to store without refrigeration, see their purchasing power erode. A food bank that budgeted $50,000 for canned vegetables in 2024 now gets 15% fewer cans for the same money in 2026. And the demand for food bank services is increasing, not decreasing. 14% of American households reported food insecurity in 2025, up from 12.5% in 2024. The Century Foundation found that 1 in 3 Americans skipped a meal in the past year. Feeding America has reported surging demand across its network of food banks nationwide. The food banks need more cans, they can afford fewer cans. And the families walking through the food bank door are the exact families who have no other option when the grocery store price of a can of beans crosses the threshold of what their SNAP benefits can cover. The Can Manufacturers Institute and the Canned Food Alliance estimated that up to 20,000 U.S. food manufacturing jobs could be at risk if tariffs cause consumers to curtail purchases of higher-priced canned goods and companies switch away from tin-plate steel to cheaper packaging alternatives like plastic pouches, cartons, or flexible packaging. That job loss would be concentrated in rural communities and small cities, where canning facilities are often the largest employer. The towns that grow the food and can the food are the towns that would lose the most jobs. And those are the same towns where the residents are most dependent on affordable canned food in their own kitchens. The factory closes, the jobs disappear. And the canned food that the factory used to produce becomes more expensive and harder to find at the local grocery store that is now also struggling because the factory workers who used to shop there are unemployed. And there is a dimension to the food bank crisis that goes beyond purchasing power. Canned food is the ideal food bank product for reasons that have nothing to do with taste or nutrition. Cans do not require refrigeration, which matters because food banks in rural areas often operate out of churches, warehouses, and community centers that do not have commercial refrigeration capacity. Cans have a shelf life measured in years, not days, which means they can be donated, stored, sorted, and distributed on a timeline that matches the volunteer-based, intermittent scheduling of most food bank operations. Cans are durable during transportation, surviving the bumps and drops of volunteer delivery runs in personal vehicles on rural roads. And cans are portion-controlled, making it possible for food bank operators to assemble balanced bags with predictable caloric and nutritional content. When canned food becomes too expensive for food banks to purchase in sufficient quantities, there is no equivalent substitute that provides shelf stability, transport durability, portion control, and refrigeration independence simultaneously. Fresh produce spoils, frozen food requires cold chain infrastructure. Dry goods lack the protein density. The can is not just a container. It is the technology platform on which American food charity operates. And the tariffs are making that platform unaffordable for the charities that depend on it most. Coca-Cola is already switching from aluminum to plastic, and what that tells you about where prices are headed. When Coca-Cola announced in February 2025 that it may shift some products sold in aluminum cans to PET plastic bottles if input costs continue to rise. That announcement was not about beverage packaging. It was a signal about the entire canned food economy. When the largest beverage company on Earth, with more purchasing leverage than any other buyer of aluminum in the consumer products space, concludes that the cost of metal packaging is becoming prohibitive, it tells you that the economics of canning have fundamentally changed. And the downstream effect of a major manufacturer like Coca-Cola shifting from aluminum to plastic is that the remaining demand for aluminum cans from smaller manufacturers gets more expensive per unit. Because the fixed costs of aluminum can production are spread across a smaller volume. The same dynamic applies to steel cans for food. If Campbell's, Conagra, and Del Monte begin shifting products from steel cans to flexible packaging pouches, or cartons to avoid the tariff-inflated cost of tin mill steel, the remaining products that stay in steel cans become more expensive because the manufacturing infrastructure that produces those cans is absorbing the same overhead with fewer units of production. Usha Haley, a professor at the Barton School of Business at Wichita State University, explained it clearly. She said the United States just does not produce enough steel, and that the country imports nearly 70% of tinplate steel for cans of fruits, vegetables, essential foods, and pet foods. And she warned of indirect costs. Because if companies that currently use aluminum shift to plastic, the increased demand for plastic raises the price of plastic, which raises the cost of everything else that is packaged in plastic. The tariffs are not just making canned food more expensive. They are destabilizing the entire food packaging ecosystem. Every alternative to a steel can, whether it is aluminum, plastic, carton, or pouch, is also becoming more expensive because every alternative is absorbing demand that is fleeing the tariff-inflated steel market. There is no cheap option left. The cheapest food in America was canned food. The cheapest packaging in America was the steel can. Both are being systematically priced out of reach for the Americans who depend on them most. And canned baby formula deserves its own mention because it represents the most extreme version of this crisis. Canned baby formula is one of the few food products for which there is literally no substitute for many families. Infants who cannot breastfeed depend entirely on formula. And the vast majority of formula in America is sold in cans or containers that use the same steel and aluminum that tariffs are taxing. The rising cost of packaging materials, supply chain constraints, and regulatory compliance costs are expected to push formula prices higher at the exact moment that WIC, the federal program that provides formula to low-income mothers, is also facing budget pressure. The 2022 formula shortage, which was caused by the closure of a single Abbott Laboratories plant in Michigan, demonstrated how thin the safety margin is for infant nutrition in America. That crisis required emergency imports, military flights of formula from overseas, and an invocation of the Defense Production Act. And the tariffs are now raising the baseline cost of every can of formula on the market, which means the next disruption, whether it is a plant closure, a recall, a supply chain breakdown, or a natural disaster, will occur on top of a higher price floor with less margin for error than existed in 2022. The cheapest food in America is disappearing across every category. And infant formula is the category where the consequences of that disappearance are measured in the health of children who cannot speak for themselves. SNAP benefits are $6 a day, and canned food was supposed to be how you survive on that. The current average SNAP benefit is approximately $6 per day per person. $6 to cover breakfast, lunch, dinner, and any snacks between meals. At $6 per day, the margin between eating and not eating is measured in cents per item. A can of beans at 79 cents is 3 meals worth of protein for one person. A can of tuna at $1.19 is 2 meals. A can of soup at $1.49 is 1 meal. A can of vegetables at 89 cents is a side dish for 2 meals. The entire architecture of surviving on SNAP benefits is built on the assumption that canned food is cheap, shelf-stable, and available. When canned food prices rise 10 to 15%, the $6 per day does not stretch as far. and the SNAP benefit amount was already scheduled to be cut. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act slashed $295 billion in SNAP funding over the next decade, the largest reduction in the program's history. Benefits will be cut approximately $100 per month for roughly 600,000 low-income households. And Gina Platonino, SNAP's deputy director at the Food Research and Action Center, warned that as grocery prices continue to rise and SNAP benefits are reduced, families across the country will be left with fewer resources to meet even their basic needs, and that we are likely to see a rise in food insecurity, housing instability, and homelessness. Park Wilder, a food economist at Tufts University who studies food security and hunger, agreed that hunger could worsen substantially over the next 2 years as a result of these policies, and called the combined cuts in price increases a sharp retrenchment in the strength of the hunger safety net. The canned food price increase is not happening in isolation. It is happening at the exact moment that food assistance is being cut, that food insecurity is rising, that grocery budgets are already stretched beyond capacity, and that the Iran war is pumping additional cost pressure through every link of the food supply chain. The 42 million Americans on SNAP are watching the cost of a can of soup go from $1.29 to $1.49 and do not have the 20 cents to absorb it. Because there are no 20 cents left, the budget was already at zero. And the can of soup that was the last affordable protein source in the grocery store is being priced out of reach by a tariff on imported steel that was imposed to protect an industry that no longer exists domestically in any meaningful capacity. The tariff is not protecting American jobs. It is destroying the affordability of American food. And the people paying the price are the people who were told the tariff was supposed to help them. Scott Breen, president of the Can Manufacturers Institute, described the situation in the clearest terms anyone in the industry has used publicly. He said the tariffs are a food security issue. He said the industry wants to be able to manufacture cans here and fill them with food grown in the United States. And he said the tariffs create an unnecessary cost that someone has to bear. And that someone is shared between the can maker, the retailer, the brand, and the consumer. And the consumer is at the end of the chain, which means the consumer absorbs whatever portion the other 3 participants in that chain cannot absorb. And the other 3 are already running thin. The packaging and container industry operates on a net margin of approximately 6.8%, according to New York University Stern School of Business data. A 25% tariff on imported steel that accounts for 40% or more of a firm's costs does not leave room for the manufacturer to absorb the increase. The math forces the cost downstream, and downstream is you. Downstream is the can of beans that goes from 79 cents to 99 cents to $1 and 19 cents to $1 and 29 cents to a price that a family on $6 per day in SNAP benefits can no longer afford. And when that family can no longer afford the can of beans, they do not switch to a cheaper alternative. There is no cheaper alternative. The can of beans was the cheaper alternative. It was the food people switched to when fresh produce became too expensive, when meat became too expensive, when dairy became too expensive. Canned food was the floor, and the floor is now being pulled up from underneath the feet of the Americans who are standing on it. And nobody in Washington is talking about it because the political conversation about tariffs is about trade deficits, about geopolitical leverage, about manufacturing competitiveness, about national security. It is never about the can of beans. It is never about the 20-year-old student in Omaha who works 2 jobs and eats Spam because it is what he can afford. It is never about the grandmother on SNAP who buys canned soup because it is the only hot meal she can make without a working stove. It is never about the food bank volunteer who watches the same dollar buy fewer cans every quarter and wonders how they are going to fill the bags in December. The cheapest food in America is disappearing, and the people who depend on it the most are the people with the least political power to stop it. Share this video with every American you know who has ever opened a can of beans, a can of tuna, a can of soup, or a can of vegetables and called it dinner. Because the price of that dinner is about to change permanently. And the time to stock your pantry with canned goods at current prices is right now. Not next month, not next quarter, not when the new contracts hit the shelves in 2027. Right now, every can you buy today at today's price is a can you will not have to buy at tomorrow's price. And tomorrow's price is higher, that is not speculation. That is what every major canned food company in America just told their shareholders on their earnings calls. Take care of yourselves out there, I will see you in the next one.